Socrates, the only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust, wind, dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
Nietzsche said you can't see around your own corner.
I mean, isn't that what these practices are trying to do, is like let you see a little bit around your corner?
Yeah, now you might be able to collaboratively give us all the chance to see 20% around our corners or something like that.
Yeah,
But then it's kind of someone else's corner. It's like the collective entity's corner. And then what can't it see, even though it can see more than we can?
Groupthink is pernicious. Yeah. Hi, Bruce.
Hello.
I just want to say, Bruce, being with you is like looking at an 80-foot tall statue covered in rubies and emeralds.
Oh, that's a nice thing to hear.
Practicing from episode 10.
Okay.
That's a great background, Bruce. It's got a real the exoticism of medieval Chinese Zen Buddhist iconography to it.
Oh, good.
It's like steampunky too. It's got there's like some dangling things in the bottom left that are almost like mechanical and metallic. Is that also Midjourney?
Steampunk Taoism.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a new game to play, kind of like our last game from last time, so we can start with that if you guys want.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, this is going to be an interesting episode to respond to, because either we're going to walk ourselves through the practices, or we're just going to be sort of commenting about practices in general, because there's not a lot of propositional articulations to respond to. It's not really concept driven, these two episodes.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a good place if anyone feels like seeing a through line through the last 9 episodes before this too. Because John said on Paul Vanderklay's like launch of this, when they got together and talked about it, that he's trying to play more with the YouTube format. So it's exactly like, oh, I just want to, share my thoughts about the arguments presented and be a part of it. And it's like, oh no, I can't do that. I can only talk about, how nice Taylor's hair is, or what Christopher looks like when he's sitting there. And that's not at all deep or profound. Well, maybe Taylor's hair is, but I don't know. Cool. Any other guiding thoughts, Bruce, about like what you thought might transpire today? Or
just talking with Layman a little bit last week, we were anticipating we might be enacting some of the practices. So I've watched most of both episodes and just got a sense of what they were doing, but didn't have a clear sense of what we're going to explore today. So I'm pretty open.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't want to do the practices mostly because I wasn't sure how it would go. And also I was kind of busy. So finding a fourth person that would really jive with this. But yeah, I'd love to hear, especially your thoughts, Bruce, about the practices, because I've actually done some of these with Layman, and yeah, he's very clever about them. He's very, very wild and fun about them. So, all right. So the first game is Guess the Philosopher. So I do this thing on Sundays at the Stoa, and one of the people there, I guess, had watched some of our episodes, and she's like, but a lot of us don't know who all these philosophers are. And then she shared this idea for a game where we could bring up in some creative way the philosophers that John brings up. And so I added a couple that John doesn't talk as much about, but I think they make the game fun. So just to make it more fair, there's quotes from all these people. So the people are, just so we're not guessing in the complete dark, Agnes Callard, Diotima, Epictetus, Henry Corbin, Iamblichus, Iris Murdoch, Joan of Arc, John Vervaeke, Kierkegaard, Martin Buber, and Simone Weil. So quite an eclectic mix. I threw John in there because I think he's a good one. All right, so I'll just read these in no particular order.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions or anything? There's just laughter, and Bruce is
No,
warmly
go
putting his hand
ahead.
on his heart.
I don't know how well I track most of those people, but bring it on.
Do you want to contemplate for a moment? We could pause in silence as you recollect their personalities or their thoughts.
I'm
No
just
hope
gonna
there.
guess Anaximander every time.
Yeah.
He's not on the list, so that would be unstrategic. Okay, I'll start with the longest one. When one makes a radical life change, one does not submit oneself to be changed by some transformative event or object. One's agency runs all the way through to the end point. The nature of that agency, as I shall argue, is one of learning. Coming to acquire the value means learning to see the world in a new way. But this, in turn, means that the process of valuing motherhood and the process of becoming a mother are not two separate events flanking a moment of decision, but rather one and the same process.
Who is Iris Murdoch?
Layman?
Who is Anaximander?
No, it's Agnes Callard. Just start with an A, so you were closest,
Okay.
Layman.
Okay.
All right. Sopherson is not just the ability to find, but the tonos in which the good can appeal to us and is something self-organizing, not just something we're doing.
That sounds like John.
I would need to see the list of all the people again.
Oh, sure. Here, I'll put them in the chat. I wasn't trying to make this like some cruel memory exercise. It just didn't want to have too few people that it was too obvious. All right, so now they're all there.
I'm just going to say, who is Epictetus?
Oh, it was John. So
Okay.
very good. Sopherson is a good Epictetus guess. All right, so don't explain yourself, your philosophy, embody it. Don't explain your philosophy, embody it.
For me, it could be a few people.
Joan of Arc.
Well, I like that one.
Seems like that's what she did.
She was not a lady of words. Yeah, she was a lady of action for sure.
I don't know. I'm just going to say Simone Weil.
Ooh, that was Epictetus.
Oh, okay. Wow. Good. Great.
It is up to each individual consciousness to develop its own symbol or symbols in its own symbolic universe.
Who is Corbin?
It is Henry Corbin, yeah. Let's see, what's a good next one? Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity.
Who is Iamblichus?
Ooh.
I don't know why. I just want to keep saying Anaximander.
Oh goodness.
Just fun to say that.
It is a fun word. Yeah, I think adding like Odoris to everyone's name is a fun game. Or Stephanie's. You can the Greek suffixes are fantastic. So that was Simone Weil. She's like awesome on attention philosophy, I would say.
Wow. Yeah.
How else would God speak to me if not through my imagination?
Who is Kierkegaard?
Ooh.
Oh, Murdoch, maybe.
So this is Joan of Arc.
Okay.
Yeah, because people would accuse her, like, how do you know? You're so confident about these things. And it's kind of cool that she's thinking in terms of the imaginal, even in the bloodiest of worlds. All right, so we'll make this the penultimate, the second to last one. Love is not a god at all, but is rather a spirit that mediates between people and the objects of their desire. Love is neither wise nor beautiful, but is rather the desire for wisdom and beauty.
I'm going to go for Buber.
Ooh.
I'm gonna go Diotima.
Yeah, it's Diotima. Yeah.
Meant Anaximander. Anaximander.
He probably did say that. Yeah, he was a chatty fellow about. All right, last one. Let's see, what's a good one? They're all so good. All right. All things in the world of nature are not controlled by fate, for the soul has a principle of its own.
Pretty sure that's not Kierkegaard, but I was hoping
That's
for
correct.
Kierkegaard.
Yeah. I'll read his.
Yeah, I don't know.
This is Iamblichus.
Okay.
And it's kind of cool, right? Because all the nature philosophers thought that like different things were controlling everybody, and then like Socrates on his death is like, well, what about me? Don't I control my destiny? Am I not more than just the sum of what's pushing me around? And so I am, because I think he's trying to point to that as well. And then yeah, the Kierkegaard was, once you label me, you negate me. So it's interesting. I didn't even mean to really, but like there's so much Neoplatonic and Platonic thought in the philosophers that John cites and brings in, even the ones that maybe aren't like aren't known as Neoplatonists so much.
I would like, maybe this is too random a thing to request, but I would like to hear all of those quotes read together as if they hung together as a paragraph.
Right now?
Yes.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'll just, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Love is not a god at all, but is rather a spirit that mediates between people and the objects of their desire. Love is neither wise nor beautiful, but is rather the desire for wisdom and beauty. How else would God speak to me if not through my imagination? Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. Once you label me, you negate me. It is up to each individual consciousness to develop its own symbol or symbols, its own symbolic universe. All art is a struggle to be, in a particular sort of way, virtuous. When one makes a radical change, one does not submit oneself to the changed by some transformative event or object. One's agency runs all the way through the endpoint. The nature of that agency, as I shall argue, is one of learning. Coming to acquire the value means learning to see the world in a new way, but this in turn means that the process of valuing motherhood and the process of becoming a mother are not two separate events flanking a moment of decision, but rather one and the same process. Worship is the practice of cultivating reverence that prevents idolatry and affords powerful symbols for what is ultimate. Sopherson is not just the ability to find, but the tonos in which the good can appeal to us, and is something self-organizing, not just something we're doing. All things in the world of nature are not controlled by fate, for the soul has a principle of its own. Every man's foremost task is the actualization of the unique, unprecedented, and never recurring potentialities, and not the repetition of something that another, and be it even the greatest, has already achieved.
Frankenstein's sage.
Yeah, I want the through line of that, but in 3 words.
It's more coherent than what I've heard from some great spiritual teachers.
I think so. Again, yeah, I agree.
I think there was a strong emphasis on love and embodiment and kind of the actualization of the imaginal running through that. Those seem to be common themes that showed up in more than one of those quotes.
It tells us something about Robert's selection parameter.
Mm-hmm.
I do love all of those things. I think, Bruce, there's a powerful philosophy in exactly those 3 things.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't appeal to like external things a lot. It's really tricky when you talk about science, which is appealing to things that you have to go on trust, and traditions, which bring in all these metaphysics and things that you have to trust. And then John's approach is so principle based and so not non-metaphysical, but quite like demetaphysicalized. And yeah, all these thinkers, they're so like existential, and you converse with them and try to see the world through their eyes, and then that kind of ebb and flow start to transform. And yeah, that was a great observation, Bruce. So yeah, I would love to hear, what either of you took from the episodes, or kind of start in that direction, even the practices or the content, the interactions is probably a better word than content.
It was really nice to hear those guys together. Created a slightly different flavor than my experience of them separately. I especially appreciated when the scribe and herald process started to get in play. I thought that was a really good extension of these processes, which are very often just focused on achieving a deeper intersubjective mutual resonance, but to try to leverage that as a method of exploring concepts or being functional in the world is not only a beautiful thing, but it is such a close approximation to what we see Socrates doing in Plato's texts. So that was really nice to see all of that emerge, and to have an attentiveness to the gestural dimension of the communication as well was really interesting. One of the things I think there's a tendency, and a couple of comments came up around whether or not you could, whether the gesture was sort of at the root of everything or not. How much is the body playing a role in all of this? From my point of view, it's sort of an integrative assemblage. So, like, if you don't have the gestural communication in play as well, you're missing something. But if you just had it and didn't have the mental or emotional, you'd be missing something just as great. It's not really about the primacy of body communication so much as about the integrative coordination of multiple inner systems. That's what creates the sense of encountering something that's deeper and more authentic. Or at least that's my general take on it.
I like what you're saying, and I hear you. I'm sorry, Bruce, go ahead.
That's right. I appreciated it, and in part as this process of adduction that they've been talking about, the really to pull what's between them in the metaxu, pull that forward, both what's internally and kind of indwelling one another, enacting the space between. I was very curious in watching that because I haven't had any experiences with John's retreats or workshops or anything like that. These were all laid out as a series of practices, and I'm curious how often they're actually done in constellation, or are they done separately? Because there was a nice synergy and momentum and deepening that built up over time as they started from the breathing and the body and connecting within and without, and then kind of going deeper into appreciation and then deeper into the adduction of the between. So there was a nice deepening and progression. I just wonder how it's usually handled.
Yeah, I think that's very purposeful. And I know John has said many times that like his encounter with Gibsonian psychology really turned him onto the idea of building towards something. So like in a typical graduate school class, you could have just like 16 topics in 16 weeks that are loosely related, that are semi-linear. And he's really trying to say like, where's the end, and what are the things that need to be done to build into that, and how does the beginning look like? So I think like his Meaning Christ series is a good technical example of that, where it's very much an arc that's unfolding and not just 15 episodes about like John's thoughts. And in his Dialogos workshops and in the ecology that he presents too, he's trying to do that. So it's like the workshops that he's now running like 3 or 4 times a year. They're 2 8-hour days, and they start with a lot of here's how, like a really simple meditation, and then you do it. So you're actually like even if you're good at meditating, you practice meditating, and then they go, okay, here's how they really do both of those, being with you, and then hearing that I feel, and then I'm curious about a story underneath that, those kind of different steps of the circling. And so day one will be 4 to 6 hours of micro lecture practice, small group practice, all kind of building on each other. And then at the end of day one, they'll do a philosophical fellowship. So they'll spend like 30 or 45 minutes framing it, and then you get to practice it, having already meditated kind of twice and done a bunch of small group kind of emotional, social building. And then the next day, they'll kind of pick up where they left off with a little bit of meditation and contemplation, and then go even deeper and get a little more sophisticated, and then do the dialogos, dialectic into dialogos practice. And yeah, like the end of it really does, like all of that effort building up to those kind of end of day and even end of weekend practices, people go like, wow, that was awesome. They have like an open chat at the end, and everyone wants to share. They're all feeling like semi-ecstatic or deeply homed, or kind of a surprising joy and things like that. And I think the linearity, like the sequencing of everything, is very purposeful. I know it was like a long explanation, but I wanted to give you a picture.
That's really helpful.
One of the things that really stood out for me was, especially toward the end of 10B, was both how similar and how tonally different it was from the way Socratic dialogues are usually presented in translations of Plato. Right? There's usually a higher degree of antagonism in the way it's usually thought about and in the way it's usually translated. Right? So if you read the dialogues, there's sort of, what's beautiful? And some idiot just says a beautiful thing, right? And then Socrates starts digging in on it. But that idiot is the proposer in a way, right? So this process starts to unfold intersubjectively. It's sort of all there in the historical dialogues, but there's this edgy thing, like somebody's an idiot and somebody's not an idiot, and people are just standing around and go, "You're right, Socrates," and all these sort of foolish little things. This process was so much of the same dynamics, but in such a non-confrontational way. Nobody's much smoother, much softer, much more embracing than the sense one gets from traditional translations of Socrates' interactions.
Yeah, I think except for the Theaetetus and the Symposium, have a much more kind of friendly relationship. But yeah, all the rest of the dialogues are like some idiot that's like a rich guy, or like highly sexed guy, or a tricky teacher guy, or whatever. Like those, they are people that are kind of antagonistic to Socrates, definitely the Republic. And yeah, I think probably like the inner teachings of Plato would be more like that, like the fellowship, like you can see in Epicurus and a lot of the Neoplatonists, they're much more um, camaraderie of exploration than, Plato was. Pierre Grimes says Plato is obsessed with like the sophists, and so he's always painting them into a corner, and he says that that's kind of a mistake because Socrates was so much more than an anti-sophist, but Plato is largely an anti-sophist. Um, so those are just a couple of thoughts that came up when you were saying that, Layman.
I was thinking about that antagonistic element and how it possibly also could be ritualized and enfolded. And I'm thinking about being in Nepal at different monasteries and watching the Dharma combat going on, where the monks stand in the courtyard and they want to make their point, and they have these gestures and they slam their hand down and stomp their foot, and then groups of people will attack them back with different questions and propositions, and then they've got to wind up. And so it's a big embodied dance and back and forth and deliberately adversarial and combative, but in the effort to actually bring out that it's the same adductive process. It's not only nailing down on getting the right dogmatic answer, but it's really pushing into and just it's using a different energy. So I'm just curious about, maybe it might be fun to experiment with a Western form of Socratic combat.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you definitely see in the Zen annals, right, the really hyper masculine aggressive style where they're throwing each other out of the teaching seat and snatching things away, and like even the greater legendary forms where parts of bodies are getting cut off and stuff. Is a question about how effective that really is and how much it conforms to a certain kind of uh, harsh living masculine reality that those people were just engaged in. Where's the feminine? Should the two styles be sort of both practiced, or is there something imbalanced with, say, the Zen way, where periodically you get these really intense breakthroughs, but in general you get all this collateral damage as well? Although it's three guys talking about what four guys just did is not necessarily bringing in the feminine, but I feel like it is important to have the main form of dialogical wisdom more feminine than the traditional Asian ones were, but having specialized subsets where people can play in the different styles would be really interesting.
Yeah, Peter Lingberg explores that. I was in a like a practice with him, and we were doing the very structured going around and sharing our thoughts and feelings. And when it was his turn, he just did nothing for like 4 minutes, and it created this awkwardness. And then we talked about that awkwardness, and it was really great to be decentered through this unconscious acknowledgement of social norms that was being brought up in a very safe, playful way, right? Like we even talked about, or he really talked about how dangerous that can be and how immature that can be. But when it was mindfully done by someone with a lot of practice, it was, I think the three of us in that group all were like, oh, this is cool. Yeah, that's right. That is an aspect of reality. How do we engage with that? Oh, my last thought too is I wonder if, Canada is part of the reason that John is so polite in his practices, and it's just like a meta level of like, well, we neither agree nor disagree with what the moose is going to do, but we respect the moose or something like that, to be completely ridiculous.
That is what it's like up here. Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. The multiple ways of adduction, and um, yeah, trying to balance those out, and so you're not so jilted when people are disagreeable, or when someone does come at you aggressively. I like the idea of Dharma combat, Bruce. You said you saw that, like you were able to. Wow, That's some other time I would love to hear about all that. That's amazing.
Yeah, but I agree with what Layman emphasized there too. I do think the feminine approach needs to be the larger container for, I think, the most healthy, fruitful, dialogical, and inductive process. But I think that there's room for those lightning strikes of sharpness and clarity that can come when you ritualize an event like that.
Yeah, the better the container and the more coherence and care is presumed and enacted in the field, the more you're able to then experimentally take on disruptions, aggressions, things like that in a way that aren't, like you were saying, Limbury said, not just the um, reactive, disruptive presence of challenge, but a productive presence of challenge. And the distinction is precisely whether or not there's an adequate amount of coherence and care in the field already to hold that. And the field can be within the individual or the field can be within the collective. But you have to have that first to make sure the challenge is correct. It's like raising kids, right? You need to secure them and you need to challenge them, but you need to secure them first so that they're capable of handling the challenge in a way that's non-disruptive to their developmental process.
Yeah, care is so subtle, and the relational aspect of the Platonic tradition, I think, gets minimized, especially in academia, where it's very much on like either the figures or maybe a little bit of the myth, or especially like the propositional content of the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And when you have a deep relationship, then you can say to your friend something honest that you wouldn't be able to say to a stranger. Um, and you'd be able to go, like, they were really doing that. You could tell that they had done these practices and had deeper relationships outside of the episodes, and that they were able to go places that only were available because of the history of the group and because of all of the pre-ritual even that kind of framed the social space for them. So I thought that was really awesome, really the value of community and the value of relationship and history. And if your good faith early is happening, then you can have these kind of profound encounters with each other in the future without trying to like control it or make it happen.
In the events where John is doing this, especially, I mean, there are 4 people who are involved in this particular process. I'm just bringing this up out of my experience with the David Bohm's work and how that's usually done. And, there's layers to what's going on and what your aim is and all of that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a commentary one on the other. But one of the arguments from Bohm was that he felt it's important to have groups of 20 to 40 people engage in dialogical process as opposed to small groups if you want insight beyond the personal and into the cultural. With groups of 3 to 4 to 5 to 7, something like that, you're mostly going to replicate family system dynamics within that circle if you sustain it over time. And you will fall into certain kinds of roles that are usually identified, with family positioning in some way and reenacting that circle. So you need a larger group in order to bring in enough competing currents that you can begin to surface some of the deep cultural and collective presuppositions that inform the field and that inform each individual, that might not show up in a safer small group context.
There's an interesting piece from Gurdjieff's biography that always stood out to me, and he recollects his various projects at different times in his life, and when he was beginning in Russia and then in Europe to try to set up these group processes, what he noticed in hindsight was that it was initially being perceived as sort of new age or esoteric or occult within that time period, and so it was attracting those types of people. So the attempt to have it with a larger group to get outside of some of the individual and, like you say, some of the domestic subconscious dynamics also can be limited by, do we have enough of the basic types of human beings involved? So he became very concerned later with having a more diverse sample of what he thought of as the basic human characters.
Were there particular types of people that he would try to get together?
Yeah, I mean, he spent a lot of time working out his own kind of typology based on some ancient systems that he had, but it would depend on what sort of framework you were using to divide up people. Maybe you want all the Myers-Briggs types, or maybe you want all the astrological types, or something like that. But it would be interesting to think what that kind of Bohmian experiment in larger scale group dynamics would be like if there was care taken to make sure there was a more diverse set of internal temperaments involved.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the like the pantheon of personalities, and if you get all Dionysus, you're like, oh, we're so smart. We brought all these Dionysians together and we had a great time. And then why isn't the culture responding to our answer, our solution that we came up with, or our new vision of the world? And I think Layman, when we did the Thumos gathering, it was like people that Peter knew that I didn't know, and people that I knew that Peter didn't know, and even I didn't know Peter that well. And there was I think it was a very rich kind of outcome where I was going like, wow, oh wow, that's interesting. And like the groups were reporting different experiences. And it's very exciting to do that, because in organizational research, one of the most, I think, interesting things I learned when I was studying it was how self-selection is just everywhere and biasing results. Because if you don't realize the people that are at a certain religious place are drawn to it because of their personality and their strengths and weaknesses, then you might say, oh, this is such an eclectic group, it's such a broad group, you know, and you can justify it and go, yeah, there was farmers and business people and men and women and young and old, and not realize there were these much richer non-surface traits that were still they all, you know, were deeply monotheistic or something, or were deeply annoyed by the other church down the road, or like, it can be really simple what attracts people and repels people. So yeah, it's a, especially when you start to think about how can these
consideration
more,
when thinking about how this stuff could be scaled up socially and what role it could play. Like we've seen truth and reconciliation processes work out, where there's a lot of concern about how you get conservatives and liberals to have better dialogues with each other, and that's usually framed in terms of healing or overcoming polarity or something like that. But there's also a question of what are the possibilities for wisdom cultivation that exist across those antagonism gaps that are one of the felt indicators that you are dealing with different types of some kind.
There's a Greek word which you might know, Robert. I think it's anakaluthia, meaning the mutual entailment of virtues. But basically that no virtue by itself really is complete and functions in a healthy way unless it's counterbalanced by at least one other virtue, you know, like courage without prudence is recklessness, and things like that. So you need these virtues to balance each other out. And so I think, in thinking about what we've just been talking about, and maybe, bringing different groups of people together, it makes sense to me to kind of frame it. And each of the groups probably privileges some virtues over others. And how can we help really call out that mutual appreciation of the mutual entailment of the virtues, if we can see, if we can help evoke the spirit of anacolluthia within the group. That's what I was thinking about.
The interplay piece reminded me of the set of definitions of sophrosin that came up in the episodes. John's piece on sophrosin is the self-organizing criticality that occurs when two opponent affects come together in the right way, and then coupled with this notion that sophrosin is the way the good embodies the world, and this other notion that it's the the way in which you select the valuable thing to do that puts you in the right relationship to all the other valuable things you can do, and then takes the overload off the table, essentially. Those were some really intriguing ways to approach it. I wonder what you guys thought were the most intriguing or resonant interpretations of sophrosin you heard in these episodes.
Yeah, that stood out to me too. The way it was like a self-organizing system, and like so easy to forget that systems are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous, and like the harmony between the difference towards the good, or towards the social good, so like the transcendent or the community without losing the integrity of the individual. I think I was reading the Protagoras last night, and they talked about that a little bit, because they go like, well, isn't something and its opposite can only have one of each? So if I know something and I know its opposite, then I'm done. And Socrates, in that unfolding, gets Protagoras to agree to both piety and folly as its opposite, and justice and folly as its opposite, and go, how can both be true, Protagoras? And then Protagoras starts to give a long-winded speech. And Socrates says, well, I can't, do a dialectic with you anymore. And yeah, it's really interesting that underneath all these differences is both a through line, but also through lines that preserve the differences or align them all towards a better future state or more intelligible present state. So yeah, I think it was really a great session that they had of the practice seeking out wisdom on sophrosin, as well as demonstrating the actual practices themselves.
Yeah, for me, just listening to them unpack sophrosin, that's why anacolluthia came in my mind. I really felt that was like underlying some of the spirit of what they were exploring in terms of the balance and the soundness and the balance of sophrosin. And so I went on Google after watching the episode and tried to find any references where people are talking about sophrosin and anacolluthia in the same passages, but I couldn't find anything.
A good name for a kid, sophrosin. It's lovely. It's an interesting thing coming out of a background in a lot of Eastern style practices. Now, obviously, you can find pretty much anything in pretty much any cultural context if you dig enough for it. But the Greek approach is sort of classically, I don't want to say mechanistic, but dynamics oriented, right? They're doing a process where they're proposing, accomplishing, processing, doing all these things. And so the notions of sophrosyn that came up were very much around how do you do something with it, or what are the mechanisms that cause it, versus a sort of Eastern contemplative style where sophrosyn would be just you locate your feeling of the good and then you concentrate all your attention and emotion just on that until it absorbs you. Right? So that's a very direct practice, but it also isn't as likely to produce the side effect of shared knowledge production.
Yeah, the Greek dialectic as a path to enlightenment or to more sophistication of understanding is, I don't know, it's really cool. It's the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, the Christian Neoplatonists, um, this spirit of like, okay, what's the suchness? Let's open up the moreness. What's the suchness in that? Okay, what's the moreness? And then you can reflect back and go, wow, what did we just make? That was really cool. And it is a much more like emergent dynamics than like a kind of relationship of like immanence and transcendence in the East, which is also, I think, why the West gets so confused by that in the East, because they're like, where's the critic? Shouldn't we be saying something to that enlightenment? Like, you're just saying nature is beautiful, but what else are you saying there? And it is kind of ironic that, the West gets so spun up, whereas that is, not necessarily in like the Chinese communism of today, but in like the artistic aesthetic of Zen and Buddhism and these movements, Taoism. You don't need to have like, what does Anaxagoras think about this, or what does Aristotle say about how beautiful this tree is? You just have your relationship with the good. So yeah, I like that, the contrast there, Layman. Is there an Eastern equivalent of Sopherson?
Hmm.
I think where you see it most is in something like just a straight up yogic devotional contemplation of the good, right? Whether the good is embodied in a guru transmitter character, or whether it's more generalized as Satchitananda. You're right that the virtues are considered to be a cluster of interpenetrating variations of one general virtue quality that's implicit in being. And you just, right, you point your attention toward it, you feel toward it, and you gesturally um, focus yourself toward it. So there's a lot of practices around simply uh, targeting it and duplicating it, just staying tightly in a resonance with it, which I think could be conceived as a type of sophrosyn practice, because it's compelling you, it's drawing you toward the good, but not by, you're not climbing toward the good or working out the good. You just find the good and then you stay totally attuned to it as best you can, heart, mind, and body, and sometimes socially.
Yeah, the Western ego is real tricky because I do some Japanese practices, and the teacher will say like it's very different to teach in the U.S. because and modern Japan is not so much this way, but like 100 years ago or not that long ago, Japan was much more this way, where it was like copy, 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 then introduce your personality. And in the West, like, what about me? What about my creativity? What I want to add this little flair to Leonardo da Vinci's style, or I want to add this. And it's like, well, copy the master first, and then go crazy with your style. But if you flip the order, then you lose the capacity to internalize deeply the principles and practices.
Did you ever see the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi?
No, but I want to find it as quickly as I can.
It's a story about a guy who became the world's greatest sushi maker, but The story is basically he's apprenticed, he's sold into sushi slavery when he's a little kid, and for years all you can do is mix the eggs, all right, and you're just duplicating, and in his particular case it becomes a sort of extended peak state of deeper and deeper insight, to the point where he becomes not only affectively radiant but capable of making the world's most extraordinary sushi. So I think in the East there's a tendency to focus more on duplicate. And if you get really good at the duplication, that's where your unique incarnation of the good will start to come forth. And I think you also don't see as much, at least in the records we have, around the intellectual production of the structures of the good, but you see a lot of physical versions of it, right? Whether it's, the music of India, or whether it's the martial arts, where they're trying to physically duplicate and find the through line to the good. There's not as much of it in terms of an intellectual dialogue tradition, although you do see bits of that in Zen. I think you see places like, I always go to Nagarjuna. I think what Nagarjuna is laying out is a way of thinking that is attracted to and simultaneous with samadhi states, right? You start to get this prajna is samadhi. Now, prajna is a debatable word, but there's a ways like, here's the logic structure, here's the thinking structure, here's the back and forth movement of thought that goes along with these states that we're practicing getting into. I think you see the glimmerings of it in some sophisticated ways, but you don't see it as richly dialogical as you do in the Mediterranean cults.
Yeah, the Plotinus, like the contemplations he does are intellectual, that go transcend the intellectual. And then like that is a good contrast to like Japanese dos, which are artistic spiritual practices, where you realize like the ineffable through this dialectic with you and your craft, or with the, like, over time, oh wow, what happened? Where did all that conceptual world go? And you just get into these kind of sacred experiences through process more than the procedural and the semantic. That's excellent. Bruce, please participate in this conversation. I feel awkward going back and forth with Layman. Hope you're muted.
You're muted.
Good ineffability.
I'm just holding up the Buddhist flower. And
I thought your hands were covered with oil like Layman's.
okay. I'm enjoying the conversation. I didn't feel left out at all. I was thinking about there's a quality of of getting out of the way and letting arise, and I was thinking about Ethical Know-How, a book by Francisco Varela, and he really is looking at the cultivation of virtue. I guess you could say almost on the embodied procedural level, and looking towards examples in the East, but very much in the East, there's while there's practices of communing and contacting and trying to exercise different qualities, ultimately, the exercise of the virtue, and the practice of the ethic is getting out of the way. It's letting the body and letting kind of the deeper being do it through you, rather than the more kind of hands-on, let's work with this, what Layman was emphasizing in terms of like the direct engagement in the process. And it's more of I think there is that kind of dialectic in spiritual traditions generally. Is the spiritual something that we produce through integration practices, through wrestling and refinement, or is it something that shows itself in the right conditions, in more as a interruption of grace through those places where we get out of the way, right? And of course, it's not either or. I think, it's both of those things, and both traditions recognize that. Not both, but both civilizations recognize that. But there's different balances in terms of how it's done.
I'm very intrigued by how it might have been done very early on at the sort of dawn of recorded history, so to speak. Having a discussion with Alexander Bard in a couple of hours about religion and spirituality at the dawn of civilization. And there's a way in which we today, and for the past several hundred years, Euro-American thinkers have hearkened back to Greece as a really culturally fertile time in which new insights, new sciences, things were being generated, and their spirituality was involved in their cultural and physical productivity. But it might be that that's a re-stimulation of a much more ancient pattern. I'm very intrigued by sort of the sages of the dawn, so to speak. I mean, who was inventing the first cities, the first temples, the first astronomy, the first symbolic communications? They were incredibly fertile and innovative people, even though we think of the past as somehow being traditional or conservative. It seems to me that there's a radical generativity and an implied dialogical creativity procedure going on among the spiritual practices of the first civilized humans, in a way, the people who transition from nomadic to civilized life. That they must have been really interested in a spirituality that produced things in the way we think of the Greek spirituality as also producing things, insights, disciplines, structures, things like that.
Yeah, it's what you were saying, Bruce. It's like with creativity, I mean, and there's a lot of different ways to be creative or to have a creative process, but one way I find that is really, well, predictably useful is just gathering a lot of material, kind of posing some questions to yourself or some framing, and then just gathering, and then letting go. And in that spaciousness, like it's just filled by whatever you gathered, and you go, oh wow. And you don't have to try to generate at that point because of all the gathering you did, like the effort. And the opposite as well, right? By just decluttering and decluttering and decluttering, and you go, oh wow, there's so much richness without trying again. And the kind of will imposition onto things is not very creative or artistic. I mean, it can be very goal oriented in a kind of productive way, but also isn't as richly generative as the allowing space and seeking inspiration. And yeah, with ancient cultures, I think the first video that John did with those tracking shamans, that's a really great way to understand something. Is if you see an animal, just to mimic its body language or its noises or its, if we weren't so distracted by technology and culture, you could watch it over a month and really internalize its perspectival and participatory natures in such a way that yeah, you don't need to have a proposition. You could easily transfer that to propositions, but that indwelling, that shamanistic kind of indwelling, is a lot better than just pure information processing.
Yeah, two things Bruce touched on. I think the productivity of feeling it flow through you, and the notion of a larger group of people involved in the processes. Both of those stand out to me as something that would have been very pertinent to the constructive spirituality of proto-civilized peoples, right? If we think about how do you make a Stonehenge? How do you make a Sphinx? How do you make a Göbekli Tepe? Something like that. There's a lot of engineering. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of moving stone a long distance and arranging it. You need a lot of people to be doing that. They have to be engaged somehow in a functional, intersubjective, large group process where they feel like it's kind of flowing. Right now, we today tend to project back the idea there's the individual genius craftsman, or perhaps the authoritarian force who's making them all build that pyramid or something like that. But it's much more likely when you look at more nomadic peoples that they've figured out some practical group trance and exchange state where they can all flowingly do very large scale production of things that are sacredly resonance afterwards.
Yeah, I love the chanting practice. I think there had to have been just a ton of chanting to build a Stonehenge. And I think I mentioned this before, but watching like 8 women like weave and like mass a loom, it's this frenzied, frenetic, rhythmic participation of creativity. And it makes like when you have the rowers have that one person that's calling time, or the drummer that's helping to keep the rhythm. It's much more embodied and inactive than like you said, like some slave master just whipping people and going, "You Jews over there, get under the temple. We're going to use your bodies as a ramp for this next column." Or yeah, like the Einstein, please solve our problems, Einstein, and come up with the plan while we all eat berries or daydream or whatever it is. Yeah, I think that's a great insight.
I think we see it more clearly, in the West when we look back at, say, Greece. It's easier for us to see it there. We don't see it as much in the East, but clearly somebody made 800-foot tall golden Buddhas. Somebody built Angkor Wat. You know what I mean? So they must have had a very engaged, very productive, something that duplicated a kind of engineering consciousness while still being within a sacred, intersubjective, collaborative process. We just don't often think of them as doing it that way, and yet they must have, because we have the artifacts.
There's something coming to my mind that doesn't, I'm not certain if it's really relevant enough to share here. I want to circle back more with the focus on the content of the videos, but I was just thinking about that process and, is that possible for us now? I mean, we definitely have specialists and everybody does that. And, maybe you might actually work exactly in this, Robert. I'd like to hear. But one of my teachers is a Tibetan Lama named Tartong Tulku Rinpoche. And one of the things that he achieved that I think is pretty remarkable, there's a very lovely, you should look at the pictures later. It's called Odeon, Odiyan, and it's a very beautiful center up in Northern California. It really is striking, amazing architecture and elegance. And the thing that I wanted to mention that was remarkable about it is most of it was built by non-specialist, non-engineer people. It was just people who had a vision and thought that they wanted to contribute to the emergence of that. And the role that Tartong Tulku played was, of course, he worked and he actually helped draw up things. But what he really tried to do was foster into people the idea that knowledge is available and that we don't have to have come. It can be discovered in the process around, the emergent vision of something. And you can definitely feel like that kind of collective gathering of intelligence and actually production of creative solutions out of people without any necessary specialized long-term education happened in some of these great historical structures. And so to me, that's an example of it happening in this time. Most of the people I know who worked on it, I know a number of people who worked on it, they had no background in those things. But nevertheless, now they've got a structure made out of glass bricks that's just amazing looking. So
that's very much the Socratic discussion around anamnesis, right, and aletheia, the unforgetting as the form of the production of knowledge, except we've normally translated that as the individual realizing some kind of generalized abstract understanding rather than thinking of the collaborative process as enacting that knowledge.
yeah, that resonates with me.
Yeah, it's like John talks about the 9 dot problem goes up like sixfold when groups approach it compared to individuals, and the idolizing and of the individual almost creates this kind of secondary structure that like prevents that from happening in our culture a lot. It's yeah, and again in these dialogical processes, I think the more you try not to impose your will on them, the more the beauty of the other people influences you and creates something. I think one of the first things I had to kind of learn, and I'm sure I could still get much better at it, is like when you start to have a thought and someone is still proposing or speaking, you have to let that go and reattend to them so that you finish internalizing what they're saying and doing, and then go back to your own attention and say, okay, well now what was there and what can I add to that, or what can I bring out? Because if you're like waiting to speak and going like, oh, I've read Nietzsche, I'm going to say this awesome quote on page 302 while someone is proposing, then all of a sudden that whole harmony is not happening. And you could really see it in the video, how they were all patient with each other, patient with themselves. And again, like we talked about at the very beginning, that shared history of doing that over time and building that kind of trust in each other and in yourself in relationship to everybody, then affords that kind of aletheic moment or that unfolding rather than that like willful expression. So yeah, I think that's excellent, Bruce.
Yeah, it is really interesting that what's coming up so much in this discussion right now is that sort of distinction between the egoic or the individual form and the collaborative form. We were talking earlier about the aggressive confrontational aspect of some of the Eastern collaborative wisdom production styles. So we can look at Zen histories and go, oh, right, I see this. There's usually like a master and an adept or a newbie, and they have these arguments, and the result of the argument is that a particular state of consciousness was produced. But what we don't normally look at, which is still implied, is they're running a whole community, right? They have monasteries, they're gardening, they're looking after each other, right? There's a whole elaborate, extended production process that exemplifies implicit knowledge being enacted and evoked between these people who are not specialists, right? They're illiterate local would-be monks. They don't have special training in how to build a monastery or how to do gardening or how to defend themselves. They're working it out collectively. And we often don't inspect that part because we tend to focus very much on what the wise guy said to one other person who was also wise or not wise.
In one of my classes, I do a dialogical and dyadic kind of exercise around the four immeasurables. I don't introduce it as the four immeasurables, and it's not framed as a Buddhist thing, but loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And the students will face each other and look into each other's eyes, and then both just reflect on each other's uniqueness and characteristics in a guided way that I lead them through, and it helps to evoke this sense of loving kindness towards the other. and then go through a deepening reflection where they both think about ways in which each other might have suffered in ways that maybe they've never communicated to another person, and really go through deepening into thinking about the other as, having experienced that depth level of feeling and suffering, arising compassion out of that. Then thinking together about what collaboratively they might do for each other to help each other thrive, and really taking delight in the one another's success, especially if you think about doing it collaboratively around some kind of exercise. So that's the mudita, the sympathetic joy. And then really, both of them kind of disengage from the mutuality for a moment and kind of drop deeper within and find their connection not only to each other but basically to everything, and that helps to kind of bring a balancing feeling of equanimity. But to me, yeah, go ahead.
I wonder if you think it's descriptive or prescriptive in the case of episode 10 of After Socrates, because you've got John and Chris and Guy and Taylor together, and it seems like they produce shared feeling qualities that are very much aligned with your description of the four immeasurables there. Now, is that because that's presupposed and necessary as the background attitude that they're bringing to the process? Or is it something that spontaneously is generated by the process of listening and giving space and communicating in a certain way?
To me, the latter feels the case, that it is genuinely emergent, at least what in my experience of witnessing what happened with the four of them over those couple hours.
Yeah, it's like it reminds me of the Civil War, how there was something like 7 times the number of bullets required to kill the people, because it's like it wasn't in their human nature to kill their brothers. And our military has mastered getting people over that weakness or whatever. And like, yeah, it seems like if you just give people the space and a little bit of structure, especially if they haven't been in that space a lot, then it kind of emerges through the process, because it's in our nature to want kinship and intimacy and someone to actually like witness our self-expression or witness someone else's self-expression.
There's
Yeah.
huge consequences for how we do the training of moral intelligence here, right? Like we have our post-secondary ethics training is usually just thought experiments, learning the names of different schools of moral thinking, or trying to imagine how you value things. Would I or would I not shove that guy in front of that train? And that's not very transformative. It doesn't really produce more moral capacity and intelligence. Whereas making difficult decisions seems to produce some of that intelligence. But these kind of group processes collaboratively evoke, like the qualities you were pointing to, Bruce, are explicitly moral qualities in a lot of ways. Those people are becoming better at being better people through that process. So one might think that would be at the very heart of any higher education around morality and ethics, rather than trying to be instructed about how to check your own values, or trying to be instructed about what the social imposition values are, or what the categories of thought are. Like, none of that stuff seems to make better people, but these collaborative processes seem to be very capable of evoking the states in which we become better people.
Yeah, moving from ethical know about to ethical know how.
Yeah, I think the whole grading structure is set up and that it discourages things that take a lot of time or require like learning about someone before you judge them, and having activity-based activities rather than semantic memorization, recall-based practices. And Zoom almost exasperates that to some degree, because colleges are just like dripping at the mouth at how much money they can save by replacing the teacher with a recording. And then you don't even have like a little bit of interaction. You just have all multiple choice video based culture transmission. And yeah, I think the potential for these practices, I know teachers get attracted to John's work. They go, oh, I want to do this with my school. Or how can I know people that have made little wisdom groups around watching his videos and doing the practices. And yeah, the practices, people go, oh wow, I'm noticing my anger, or I'm noticing other people's perspectives, I think. And that it's a whole different frame than the kind of the power that Napoleon had when almost everyone in France was able to read. They could just give books to individuals to train massive amounts of people and transmit knowledge through the printed word. And now that's been so captured of everything we do that the actual human interaction and the embodiment is like alien to even like a pedagogical approach in most fields. I mean, I've studied pedagogy, and it's all about like, how do we test them? How do we generate the knowledge required for the students to learn? And it's very semantic based. That I always loved like what you're doing, Bruce, with your students. When I had teachers, I had this awesome philosophy teacher. He would take us outside. We'd sit in like a warm Florida day on the grassy field next to like an amphitheater on a college and talk about courage and, you know, point to people that were walking by, and just that embodied approach is so much better. And you know, the ADD and the hyperactivity of just sitting in one place from the time you're as, you know, third grade or whatever, you just sit there and absorb words. It's so much more fun to do that once you get a feel for it, and once, if you have a good teacher that doesn't make you feel like foolish for not knowing what to do, and things like that. So yeah, I would love to see more science in that direction and more insight into how to do that with people that isn't just on a retreat, or isn't just if you're lucky enough to bump into people that are doing it.
There's a systemic addiction problem relative to language, it seems like we touched last time on Antisthenes trying to point out problems with language, like you can't really describe the opponent processing well because it tries to eliminate contradictions. But what you're pointing to, Robert, is this: it's so easy to use words as the evaluation metric. It's like dangerously easy. It's like processed white flour or processed sugar. It just gives you that one tiny little hit. It's kind of exemplifies the whole modern system. But the institutions get that hit, and it's so fast and so immediate and so simple to handle. They literally can't do anything else. They fall into an addiction pattern around that kind of evaluation metric. And it squeezes out the evaluation that we'd do in person with someone to figure out if they're actually getting things or deepening apart from the understanding of the words. As a result, one of the things you get downstream from that is the kind of culture where people are hyper concerned about the ethical implications of the wording of what we're doing, and not so concerned about making us be actually better people with each other.
Two things on my mind, one of which I was going to share just in my experience of back when we were on campus. I had to always be a little bit careful about this because we did have the law students down the hallway and the somatic sports psychology people, you know, on the floor right below us, and they have their own ways of looking at things and may not really appreciate what we were up to. But I used to take the students in the evening. We'd all walk in a single line very quietly, nobody talking, all the way through the building down to a lake, and everybody would gather around a lake under the stars. And then we would do this recitation about death. What are the gifts of death, and what does death make possible in life? And there was a set thing where people would talk about, established recitation, but then everybody would spontaneously need to be able to bring forward something about how death is also vital to life, right? And so, anyway, just was thinking about those ways of engaging with people. We don't make room very often for that, and even in my school where I have the okay to do that, I have to do it carefully because there are definitely departments within our school that are not going to look kindly on this inactive, ritualized way of learning. That's not just the semantic processing. That's not just the ability to reproduce sets of data and that kind of thing. The other little piece that's, I'm sorry, apologize for them being disjointed, but a while back you were asking about, what's the Eastern equivalent of Sophrosyn? And I've never really thought about it, but I'll only tentatively say it now, but of the four immeasurables, I would say it's equanimity, because equanimity, it can be understood as a kind of indifference. There's a kind of stereotypical, caricatured way of seeing equanimity as basically this practiced indifference in the face of suffering or whatever. But it's not that. To me, the equanimity emerges out of the deep processing of existential questions and concerns and contacting multiple layers of yourself, and then finding the ability to basically hold hold the right proportion perspective in context with moderation, with wisdom. It is a relevance realization kind of process to arrive at equanimity. So that's my offering there.
Yeah, that's great because, and you see that very clearly in something like the Taoist Chinese thought, right? Where there's a generative equanimity that includes the balance of these forces. You don't seem to see it as clearly in Indian thought, right? Where there is this notion of, Krishna is beyond good and bad karmas, the Brahman is beyond good and bad karmas, but there's not a lot of discussion around how that beyond is situated relative to the good and bad. Right? The interstitial mechanism is not described very frequently. And so you get this sense of this detached state that has nothing to do with the duality, an equanimity free of the opposites, rather than one that is, like they said in the video, self-organizing at a particular conjunction state of those opposites and simultaneous with that self-organizing conjunction.
Yeah, I like
which
the
apparently
Greek
looks like
metaphor.
this, by the way.
Say that again, Layman.
Which apparently looks like this.
Yeah, that's the universal symbol. Yeah, even other primates do that when they're speaking of that sophrosinic balance between opposites of equanimity. Yeah, it's really interesting trying to locate these within other schools and see that there are these, as John says, processes and principles that can be kind of scaffolded into practices and that underlie healthy, generative participation in the social, personal, and ecological dimensions. And yeah, it's amazing, really, that these principles underlie so many different systems. Like there's these ants in South America that never hurt their like fellow ants and were very good at other animals and things in their environment. And then they get blown to North America and then they attack their relatives because they've evolved differently. And it's like, if there was not cultural interpenetration and interaction, you'd think your system was perfect and you'd think like, oh, we don't need, but we're in this pluralistic universe that is in some sense a blessing and a curse, because you can start to map these principles that are happening across systems. You go, oh wow, the Greek set of virtues is actually not that different than the Chinese or the Native American or whatnot. And you could say, but there's differences too. Like, what can we learn from these external traditions? Or but at the same time, it's you're unhomed because it's so easy to know your role within your family, and then once you're thrust into a larger culture, to go, oh, this person just grabs the ketchup. We always asked for it at my family dinner, and now I'm confused at how to do that. Or I was with Rick one time, and we were kind of just complaining about the chaos of the world, and he was like, "Well, at some bus stops, everyone gets in line." So I went to this bus stop that I don't normally go to, and I stood at the front, and then everyone rushed in front of me, and I was upset and confused. And like that's kind of the world that we're in, especially with the internet. You can totally get Tucker Carlson, then John Vervaeke, then an artist that just paints tiny elephants, and then a piano player style that you've never heard before because it only existed in some small mountain in Tibet. And it's like, what do I do with all that? How do I find like one mosaic picture that holds all of those disparate images?
This is where, for me, I think a lot about the resonance between the imaginal proto-cultural and the emerging transcultural, right? Because there's something about, like you're saying, in the digital information universe, you're constantly exposed to information that comes outside of the ethos you're used to. The mores are different, right? So you don't know. You're always encountering what seems to be the wrong training, the wrong patterning in other people, which is very divisive, very agitating all the time. And there's something nice, for me at least, about thinking of the sort of wisdom roots of human civilization, something that's upstream of all that diversity. Not that there wasn't diversity in the Neolithic time period, but there's a way in which all of the traditions we inherit have some commonalities in the shamanic form of wisdom at the dawn of civilization. And I think that kind of approach was very good at doing the balancing that we're connecting with Socrates, right? That the shaman was able to heal and curse, that the shaman mediated between nature and the village, that the shaman was a figure of the day and of the night, of regular consciousness and altered consciousness. There was a lot of these just sort of basic yin yang experiences that people have in embedded ecological and social contexts that I think was probably central to the proto wisdom tradition out of which the wisdom traditions emerge. And that probably tells us a lot about what it's like to do wisdom practice now when you're outside, you're unhomed relative to the traditions we inherit. Even people who are very deep in traditions are still being exposed to all the other traditions because everyone's being exposed to everything now. So we've got to find some way of grounding ourselves in an approach to wisdom practice that is extra traditional. Even if you want to go at it in the form of a particular tradition, it's going to have something in common with what it was like to stand prior to the traditions.
Yeah, my
Yeah,
silence is an assent to that. Yeah. I'm just thinking about the shapes that that might take.
I think we see it in the the way Germain likes to phrase the meta modern as the both and connects that to things like Yoruba practice in Africa.
Mhm.
I think we're seeing, I think we see it in McGilchrist. We see this recalibration of the left-right balance. That the whole period of time of urban living and writing as essential to the spiritual traditions create a little bit of a left brain exaggeration,
Mhm.
and that we might be learning our way back to a different right brain left brain balance that may have been typical of people prior to civilized existence forms.
You say more about the Aruba?
The Yoruba,
Aruba?
it's a kind of quasi voodoo African religious culture that Jermaine Marvel, who's sort of the leading voice in Black metamodernism, has become very interested in this ancient African tradition and the way that it embodies the sensibility to which metamodernism and some of the other postmodern cultural traditions are pointing. This ability to do both and thinking, to make these sort of balanced hybrids and to negotiate the sophrosynt within knowledge might be an extension of a kind of embodied cultural sensibility that people have in their brains and their bodies to do that negotiation, to go back and forth on things. And it's certainly reasonable to think you can find that in some very old cultural traditions that have been successful on this planet.
In thinking about, different modes of, of processing, and what I heard in these videos, there was the embodied practices and the breathing, and there was a lot of exchange at the verbal. Does John in his groups do anything more imaginal in terms of non-discursive, but more imaginally focused types of practices?
Not in these, but when I started practicing with John and doing these, I got a lot of benefit about just doing Tai Chi, which is very imaginal. And I would maybe, so if we were meeting at like 10 or 11, I would do a bunch of breath work and then do a bunch of Tai Chi and then do a bunch of meditation. And then we would come into that very like interpersonal semantic space. And I would leave and have just the most profound experiences after. I mean, it was super fun, like doing anything with John and Tracy and Kira was a great time because it really got me out of my head and into like the social and into the emotional. And but yeah, I think the imaginal stuff is when I do work with Nathan and like the Respond crew, which Layman is kind of a part of, very much is wondering like how do drama and imagination and metaphor and the sensual, not the intellectual, and I find that those faculties are very different than the practices that were in those videos. Because to me, it's almost like going into like a moonlit world, like you were saying, Bruce, and going like, ooh, what is it? Like, why am I really skinny in that mirror and then fat in that mirror? And is that mirror has something behind me? Like, look out. It's a totally different sensation. And I do depth therapy. I take classes and hang out with Tom Cheetham, who is a Henry Corbin scholar. And the kind of analogical reasoning and intuitive imaginal faculties that Plotinus did get into when he would use images and discursion to transcend to the one, but these are different than that. They're very much more and they transfer so well. That's what's so interesting, is these practices that John does stay in that container very, very well. But a lot of these more imaginal embodied practices, you can be somewhere totally new and then all of a sudden have like a very felt sense of what's happening. And so I, alongside what I love about John, am exploring these things and find them so rich. And very potentially dangerous, right? Because when you start getting into like collective presencing, you can really get people's dark sides dumping out and get weird, bizarre things dumping out. So I really prefer hanging out with exactly you two when I'm wondering about these things, because your experience and groundedness makes that kind of shadow element almost benign or non-existent. But I've definitely practiced with less experienced people, and you go, holy crap, I think someone just dumped like their anger at their mother into my unconscious, and that's not cool at all. So that was a bit verbose, but yeah, I love what you're saying, Bruce and Layman.
That touches on a couple of things that we were discussing earlier in this conversation. One is the feminine and care elements of coherence necessary to enable the play in the more aggressive and disruptive modes. The other one is this came to me as you were saying that the build-up we discussed at the beginning of the way the practices demonstrated in episode 10 sort of fold into each other. There's also the sense in which there's a pre-build-up just to get to the ability to use language, right? It's relatively safe to do this with language. But if you started with movement and then you move to just making noises and then you move to gibberish, right? And then maybe you got to language. That's a very profound possibility of buildup, but it would have to be held carefully because, like you're saying, Robert, the possibility of crazed intersubjective emergences. I mean, that's what we see. There's where the mob violence and the orgies and the craziness occurs, is when people are tapping those things and there isn't a sufficient container that's reliable enough to hold that with coherence and deftness.
Yeah, there's a lot of wild power in the unconscious, and like that's where our culture lacks the kind of shamanic elder. There's no one to visit when you tap into that howling and that babbling, whereas other cultures you could just go and they'd go, oh yeah, talk to that guy up at the hill. He's mostly alone. He never comes out, and he doesn't even look out his windows, but he might show up if you sit there for 3 days, and then you get an answer. So yeah, I would love to explore more of like how to howl and babble and dance our way into wisdom, as well as these very sophisticated kind of Vervaekian psychotechnologies.
One of the reasons I was asking that, our last conversation with John, which hasn't been published yet, it'll be published on Friday, I think, got very much into this question of the imaginal, and the work that he's been doing around imagination. So I'm just was curious how it's showing up in the practice environments, or maybe that's still kind of growing and developing. Yeah, and in terms of the what Layman was sharing in terms of like the that pre-preparation, right? Embodied preparation before you even get to the verbal. I haven't done it but I've recommended students go do it and then come back, but it'd be nice in a retreat environment or something. There's like the 5 rhythms dance, which is there are different traditions, especially in California. It's pretty popular to do different kinds of forms of ecstatic dance and things like that. That's a spiritual practice for a lot of people around here. But 5 rhythms is a very interesting experiment, informed by wisdom traditions, where there's the sense that certain cognitive styles and certain emotional valences connect in an embodied way to certain rhythmic patterns in sound and in the body. And so it's a disciplined way to slowly move through 5 different fundamental rhythms as 5 different fundamental styles of cognition, 5 different fundamental emotional feeling states, and then doing a practice that kind of begins to integrate all of those together. So you kind of slowly move through touching each of those, and then you integrate them. And so I think that, together with Tai Chi taps into certain kinds of feeling, but I think the 5 rhythms actually gives you a fuller scope of things to contact. And then also, I was just thinking about in you were talking about the babbling and the howling and stuff like that. And within the Tibetan tradition within which I practiced, there is definitely a whole ritualized element around that, where after some very, very serious discipline practice, there's a whole period where people it's almost never done here in the West because maybe there's still a little bit of uncomfort with that. But there actually is an encouragement to go out into the wilderness and just like act insane, just do the babbling, just like let completely shed all of the conventional armorings, all of the purity code stuff that that holds us within certain personality shapes, to explode that within a ritualized space.
Yeah, it's so multi-useful because it's cathartic just getting, if you have that underlying in your psyche somewhere, just letting it actualize outside of the mental landscape. And then it's like gymnastic in that the learning what is the safe level of this, what is too little or too much, and by experiencing the whole range of humanity or different frequencies of expression and those kind of things, it's um, it's very powerful, and we our ego and our social kind of super ego are so inhibitory that they keep society working. They'll keep you acting the way you need to act in your little relational ways, but they can really create a lot of suffering in a person and then thus in the community where the Jungians talk well about this, that like if we don't get out of our shadow as a culture, we're so much more powerful. Having a really like dysfunctional person in 1400 is very different than in this decade, and we see this in the news. And so and it's so much creative potential, like even beyond all of those kind of self-regulating aspects, when you can tap into these super sensual and multi-aspectival parts of ourselves, that's where poetry comes from, and orchestra and myth, and it's the sooner we rehome that in the West, I think the better. And I know in my personal life, the more I practice with these things, again, like learning, like, oh, don't, that's the darkness. Don't let that take over. Or, oh, there's so much creativity there. I couldn't believe that it was right underneath my consciousness if I would have just played in there a little bit. And then all of a sudden, the whole world is framed different to me, like my salience landscape and the affordances that present themselves to me um, are different. I mean, one of the things I love about Layman is he's like, Rob, you should go out and touch trees and lick flowers and those kind of things. And I go, oh, that's really interesting because, my modern sensibilities don't think that way. But if I start participating in the world differently, I still haven't talked to any boxes yet. That's outside the scope of my norms. But by doing that in a safe way and starting to learn how to play better with these different modes of being, there's this whole richness that unfolds between the self and the world that reading books kind of can do, because it opens you up imaginally to things, but also you can be very stifled by the persona and the ego that we inherit. So yeah, I love where this headed today.
The discussion point from earlier about the role that a broader range of types can have in facilitating interpersonal wisdom production, I think that's relevant here because that larger tribe, so to speak, is more likely to contain people who have explored this in different affective styles. Right. So right now we sort of have in the West, a main culture, and then these different subcultural pockets. And each of the subcultural pockets has part of the answer. And one of the things that the subcultural pocket of very literate, very thoughtful, well-spoken white guys who want to figure out how to communicate with each other in a deeper way, that's great. But where's the improvisational jazz musician? Where's the crazed surrealist artist? Where are these other types who've been exploring it in their own niche areas? If those can come together in a kind of unique transdisciplinary way, then you might produce something that can move central block of the culture forward in a way that none of these pockets could do on their own.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, I think that really is. We need just to attend so much better to those things. It made me think of one of the students that's been in my classes for years. She just seems to keep going on and on with her program. She's making her way through the program at her own pace, but often what she gives me in response to assignments asking for exploration of philosophical ideas or cosmological narratives or something like that, I will get an improvisational dance from her, or she will show up on video with a mask and enact something. So she shows up very, very differently from a lot of the students, but there's so much there that she surfaces for the entire class. I could be a strict person and say, oh, you didn't write these 500 words on this little section of your paper, and then blah, blah, blah. But, I don't do that, because what she brings is so rich, and it actually just changes the dynamic of the whole classroom space by allowing people to see how this intelligence works through these channels.
Yeah, I love that. And art is so powerful in the contemplative existential sense that I used to go to a lot of conferences when I was an academic, and they often had like a checklist form you'd fill out. And I remember they had a conference I went to where you could check off that you were going to do interpretive dance as your presentation. I was like, where is that person? I would walk around the room like hoping to find that person. And it's so, the norms are so antagonistic, not even neutral or like hiding it, but like antagonistic to that kind of experimentation, that there's like Afrofuturism, and the creativity of different music styles, and even just chanting. Chanting is such a, unless you're in the Christian monastic, certain types of Gregorian chanting, that is very weird in the West, and they're finding like so good for the immune system. It's so good to get below the propositional or outside of the propositional, whatever preposition you want to use. And I think there's it really taps into the emergent kind of play that probably will lead to solutions. I don't know if you saw when Jim Rutt and his kind of crew made a video game on Game B, Meaning Crisis. Mm-hmm. It's like, or even Layman, when you did that kind of surreal speech that Peter had you host on the Stoa, and that kind of stuff it's inspirational in a way that, especially the more you can play with it and go like, oh yeah, there is more than this very tragic, bland vision of the world that we're all kind of stuck in the financial, scientific age, political age, that harnessing it and finding how to bring it in a more practical way than just leaving it in the art objects that they're creating, which are beautiful and nice. And maybe that is just how you survive an age like ours, is in those creative spaces. But finding ways to tap that creativity into like John's work and go, oh, how can you take this, unique thinker, or people like him, not to over focus on John, even like guys circling or tailors circling and those kind of things, and say, oh, what would it look like as a drama? What would it look like as a piano piece? What would it look like as a dress or a toga or a song? And and then you're home. Like, just being creative is so homing and rewarding. I'm sure that student has a lot of internal happiness in that expression, that like just enacting it is so meaningful, that you feel less alienated and less unexpressed, and those kind of things that John points to as the kind of culprits of a lot of this meaninglessness. I think those are some, and I like that we didn't have to go into like super abstract philosophy to get to what we're talking about. This is something kind of everyone has some access to, and the degree of technical mastery isn't the important part of what we're saying.
I think the everything you just described there, Robert, sounds very consonant with the kinds of information technologies we have now, right? That we can, the same device can give you your finances or your music or your socializing or a meditation app, right? And also there's customizable interfaces for any kind of data set, right? We don't necessarily take advantage of those, but in principle, you could look at your taxes as the flight of some birds or as a topological landscape or as a sound poem or whatever. These machines don't care what the style is. And I think that's going to help us potentially understand the importance of being able to fluidly switch those styles ourselves.
You know Hadley Wickham? He's a data scientist. I used to do a lot of big data stuff, and when you said that, Layman, it's that the visualization and expression of data. There are some people that take it to this like artistic beauty, and it takes a certain kind of genius to be both technically sound and creatively sound. But when they do it, like he has this grammar of data he's famous for, and he talks about like, you know, the type of chart you use and the type of formatting and how it has an aesthetic impact, like a perceptual impact on the whole relationship and experience. And if you can start to grok that and apply it, it really adds this level to the mostly conceptual spaces that we are inhabiting. And yeah. So I love that. There is some really, and even just like say like redefining what creativity is, like taking it out of this very like avant-garde bubble that it sits in and saying, no, creativity is everywhere. It's in you know, not only your clothes and your hair and all those kind of things, and but it can be central. Like just a really creative day on Earth is worth doing. It's not like some secondary characteristic that you, oh well, we've got this entrance way to the building, let's make it a little pretty. It's like aesthetics can be incredibly primary, and I think there is something reverential and homing about those modes of our being. That yeah, this has been a great talk today. I really like where it went. Any final thoughts? I know we've been going for a while. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
When we were talking before about the collaborative anamnesis, right? The way that certain even technical skills are more likely to be produced by people in a certain kind of relationship. My guess is that form of production of capacity is much more likely to be spontaneously aesthetic than when the individual tries to do it on their own.
There's both, because I think like some artists try to impose their will on a blank canvas, and other artists try to find beauty and get struck by it. And I think like learning both modes or multimodal versions of that. But yeah, I like what you're saying.
That's was one final thing, because I guess we're done now. But when I was talking about the proto-civilized people, right, there's a shift that goes on, and I think pottery is a big transition, because before pottery, everything you needed was something you elicited from the stone, right? That was the standard form of technology, was we get together and we find the forms inside the rock. As soon as you go, oh, I can think of a form and I can make it in pottery, that begins a different kind of journey. But the Neolithic peoples were, all they could do was evoke the forms and the structures and the tools.
As I am sitting here together with both of you, I'm feeling a great deal of warmth and a regret that you live so far up in the icy north.
I hear that regret, and I'm noticing a great joy at the callback that it represents. And I miss you.
Yeah, we should find a way to. John's conference is in California. We could do a podcast uh, in California, or find some way to embody this digital existence. Because I think that's an easy next step for just people in general, is start to try and find communities locally, whether it's a taekwondo gym or a pottery class or a dancing with others. Like, there are so many meaningful ways to participate in life beyond like just three white guys talking about ideas online. So yeah, being with you both is like having a slice of birthday cake in a butterfly garden.
Like, I'm imagining the butterflies are like touching the icing and getting stuck, and could be a tragic situation for the butterflies, but it would be wonderful to be in that situation with you.
It's a cake that like they neither smell nor taste. They don't even notice it. Yeah.
Okay.
Being
Would
with
be
you,
like a
Layman, is like a
delicious
butterfly
icing
tragedy. That's
covered
exactly what I was
butterfly.
trying to evoke. Yeah. Very good. Well, I will see you both next week. It's always a joy, and yeah, thanks so much.
All right. All right. Take care.
Bye.